with great pleasure that I introduce Iain McGilchrist to Kainos. So Iain, welcome, or welcome back in some sense, but it's great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's very good to be here. And welcome to, thank you for being here, all you people. And let's hope that we can get something going.
I'm sure we can get into some new territory, which is always the intention with these conversations. So,
Okay, no, fine. Yes, well, that's the meaning of kainos, isn't it? So,
yes, in sense, yes, indeed. So, so what we'll do, everyone, we'll do similar format to normal. Iain and I will have a conversation for maybe 45 minutes, and then we'll open up to Q&A and do it like that. So, first off, Iain, I mean, there's a lot of things I'd like to ask you, and I've been reading your work, and I'm sure everyone in this call is aware, and for anyone watching, you know, Iain's joined Substack quite recently. Maybe, what is it, Iain? Maybe a month or two ago?
Yeah, less than 2 months, certainly. About a month, yeah.
How are you finding it so far?
I'm finding my feet. I mean, there's still a lot about it that I don't really get, and I'm probably, not using it to full advantage and all that kind of thing. But I certainly don't want to make a huge deal out of it, and it's entirely free, so anybody can join it. If you want to send me some dosh, I'm delighted. Very generous of you, but that's the way it works. Yeah.
Fantastic. And so some of what you've been publishing recently has been in a similar vein to where my thinking's been, and I thought it might be interesting just to get your initial take on where we find ourselves right now in well, let's say the history of the West, perhaps world history, you know, being in this moment where we're living through the end of the liberal world order, and in this I'd say very chaotic liminal space between worlds. We don't know quite what's going to unfold. You've touched on this a little bit in some of what you've written, but I thought it'd be a good place to start. You know, how are you perceiving everything that's going on at the moment?
Well, I suppose the way I'm seeing it is I'm trying to look on the positive side of things. Is that I felt we were stuck. I think we are stuck. And I think for something like 25 years, whatever government was in power has pursued, broadly speaking, very much the same trajectory, and something needed to be shifted. And of course, that's very painful. And so I'm not surprised that, some of it is not what one wants, but I had mixed feelings about Trump, and I still very much do, although the bit that was positive is beginning to wane. But there's no doubt that things needed a shake-up, and he's doing that. I don't think that the word liberal is an interesting word, the liberal world order. I don't know that it's been that liberal since about the 1970s or 80s, really. I think that was a great liberal period. And it was a lovely period to be alive, and it was had a lot of life in it. There wasn't yet a stranglehold of bureaucracy. There was hope that there were going to be lower differentials of income between the very rich and the very poor. I couldn't have anticipated that we would go back to a world where a tiny handful of people have all the money. And so that was a great time, but gradually, through people who call themselves liberal, but are actually, in my view, authoritarian. I call them the authoritarian left. They have tried to restrict, constrict what it is that one can say, what it is one can think. Life has become much less enjoyable to live because everybody's watching what they do, what they say, worrying about something. There's hardly any joie de vivre evident, even amongst young people. It seems very sad for them. I mean, they do sometimes say to me, no, it's okay, we do. But when I just think back to how free we felt, I mean, there was something irresponsible about that, partly because our freedom was underwritten by things that we were taking for granted. In fact, it was underwritten by the dutiful hard work of our parents and their parents. And the fact that we completely disrespect that now grieves me greatly. All functioning societies around the world, other than this one, think that the ancestors play a very important role, and they respect the ancestors and they respect those who are coming after them and look after whatever it is they're holding for them. I feel we've lost that, so that we're now not in a temporal flow anymore with those behind us who help make what we have received, and those to come that we need to think about what we're handing on. Instead, we've become atomistic. This is all very familiar territory. And atomistic in space as well as in time, despite the fact of the internet. So that, the internet and AI promise these ideas that look good on the surface, but anybody with any insight can see right through them, that they're not actually working to our advantage. Now, I suppose that's a rather pessimistic view, but there's a hell of a lot at the moment to be pessimistic about. I am quite hopeful, though, and there are 2 or 3 reasons for that. I mean, one is that actually I think that hope is a duty, and that once you lose hope, you actually damage the chances of being able to move to a better place. But it's not just that. It's that when I look back on history, I can see times when people must have thought, good Lord, this is the end of everything. But it wasn't. And humanity is remarkably resilient, remarkably resourcewful. We're much cleverer than we've become, I think. That actually is a very big issue for me. When I read I don't want to go off on that now, but when I see these things by people who are teaching in schools and in even universities about the level that is being achieved, it's sort of below anything one could ever have dreamt of. And the idea that, striving, working hard, being open-minded, being as good and as excellent as you can be, these things are now sort of frowned on, and again, I think by these liberal authoritarians. The other thing is that the other thing that really makes me hopeful and is more important than anything is that young people are fed up with the way things are in this totalitarian milieu. It's not going to be changed by people of my age or a bit younger. It's going to be changed by young people who are thinking something's got to go. This is ridiculous. And they're absolutely right. And they're turning back to religion, which I think is, it's very obvious now. And this seems to me important, because I believe that it doesn't matter how good we got at trying to reverse some of the damage that we've done to, for example, the oceans and the rainforests, and to the way of the world of indigenous people. If we remained the same materialistic, spiritually barren people that we seem to be, we will have got nowhere further on. And, I look back, I read a lot of Hannah Arendt and Solzhenitsyn. These were people who influenced me all my life, and I still find them profound. And I think that certainly Solzhenitsyn would say that without turning back to the spiritual, he would say to God, just let's not mince words, without rediscovering God, we can never rebuild our society.
Yeah, this has been a major theme in my thinking recently as well, and we've had several conversations on Kainos already about the resurgence of Christianity in particular, because that's the one, certainly I'm most familiar with, and probably most of us tuning in. That's our cultural legacy.
Yes.
And I had this moment, I was in Australia recently, speaking at a conference called Wisdom in Action, which was great. And right at the end, I was on the closing panel, and I kind of made the argument that that human beings can't be the source of their own transcendence. This is the transhumanist argument of we're all going to upload ourselves into machines, and instead of transcending either through the sacred or through Christ or through through a deeper form of consciousness, we'll just do it ourselves. And somebody in the audience quite vehemently disagreed and said, no, we've got everything we need inside us. And I found it such an interesting juxtaposition, because I felt, well, no, actually this position I'm holding is that very specifically we don't, and the problem is that we think we do. And so yeah, let's maybe dive in a bit into the resurgence of religion and the ways that could look, because I know a lot of people, when they hear that, they worry about, I guess, what Carl Jung referred to as creed rather than religion. This idea of just simply a power structure that you go to church on Sunday because it's a socially endorsed thing. But I think you're maybe talking about something different when you say religion. So maybe we could unpack it a little bit.
Yes. Just before that, I think the notion that we have it all inside us, if it was meant in a certain way, it has a truth. And I think that what we have inside us is the something that seeks for and needs and longs to meet and to encounter and to become part of the divine. So in a way it's right, and in a way it's completely wrong. We need that other that's there. But it's true that we weren't born without we have the potential. As Keats, such a wise young man, I mean, good Lord, in his early 20s said, this is a veil of soul making. And you can either choose to make and grow your soul, or you can choose to stunt it. The choice is yours. Unfortunately, what you do also affects other people, because we're all connected to one another, we're all in relation to one another, and none of us is just an atom. And of course, there's so much to say about that. But coming back to the religious revival, yes. For those of you who may or may not have come across the last big book I wrote, the Matter with Things, the final substantive chapter before the epilogue is called The Sense of the Sacred. And it took me over a year to write that one chapter. Mind you, it is about 110 pages. It is about a small book. But I wanted on no account to leave this out of the purpose of the book, which was, what can we take to be truer than its opposite? I mean, finding the truth with a capital T, and the very left hemisphere idea, it's sitting out there, we take steps, we get closer and closer, and bingo, we've got the truth. But it's not like that. Truth is an unconcealing, an unveiling of something that is otherwise veiled and concealed. But I wanted to take people on a journey in which I showed them that there is a great difference between the way in which the right and left hemispheres contribute to truth, and then talk about the paths that we can follow through reason, science, imagination, and intuition, and then to look at the structure of the cosmos, what you might call, with a very bad metaphor, the building blocks, but they're nothing like building blocks, like time and space and matter and consciousness and all those things. But I really wanted, above all, to stress values, and particularly the value of the sacred, as things that we don't make up. I'm convinced that these are not things that are invented. They are things that are discovered, and we either fail to discover them or succeed in discovering them. And when we discover them, they enrich us, and we are able to reflect and help grow those values. So it is a symbiotic, living, organistic thing, not any kind of mechanistic path to truth. And I always say about the spiritual life, and that faith is not a matter of propositions, it's a matter of dispositions. And your disposition is what really matters. Once again, it's a thing that I've said for 30, 40 years, is that we're obsessed with the what all the time, but actually the how matters even more than the what. And the disposition is what makes a living faith. And the trouble with Christianity is that it has, more than most religions, a set of, on the face of it, rather baffling propositions that if you think, well, I've got to sign up to all those, you probably never make any progress. My view is that, in fact, although they appear baffling at first sight, if you don't worry about them too much, but take them as having metaphorical meaning, and get into the water and swim, if you see what I mean, it's no good sitting on the bank saying, I'm learning how to swim from a book. You've got to get in and do it. But if you do, you'll find that these things that sound so peculiar, I mean, let's take the Trinity, which when I was a teenager, I thought, well, that's just such a bad idea. But as I've got older, I've seen the Trinity as more and more profound. And by the way, it's not just a Christian belief. It's in many religions and greatly antedates Christianity, but it is a very, very important idea.
Now, this is other theme that has come up in conversations on Kainos, and is also a major theme in the documentary I'm working on, Crossroads, which is incidentally almost finished for everyone, especially if you saw half of it. Yeah, but it's funny because I've learned that, and this is a common phrase, documentaries happen in the editing suite, so they kind of form as you bring all the voices together, etc. And what's really formed out of this is this. I would say split. I don't think they're truly split, but let's say a cultural divide that I see growing as people seek out new religions, including AI religions, which is another thing I've been writing about, between those who want to come into, leave the online world, leave the abstracted, disembodied world, come into human contact, talk about political ideas face to face, where we can kind of, share bread and be around a fire, which I fully agree with.
Absolutely.
And then there's, you have on the other side, sort of techno-feudalism is a term by Yanis Varoufakis, where we have these kind of digital fiefdoms controlled by a handful of trillionaires. And within those, we have algorithms that are continuously abstracting over and over. So our financial system is a system of abstraction, etc. So this movement to abstraction and this movement to connected, relational connected embodiment. Now, my sense is that, and this is what I wanted to ask you about, as human beings, if we set aside the fact that our technology certainly enhances that abstraction quite severely, it seems to me that we are always both in some sense. We are always, connected into the now and abstracting. Now, is it too simple to say that the left hemisphere is more involved in that kind of abstract moving beyond what's here and the right less so, or how does it work in that model?
Yes, a difficult one to do quickly, but I think that the main point would be that this is quite an important one, is that the left hemisphere doesn't understand time. I mean, that might sound an extraordinary thing to say, but I have a long chapter on time and argue, I think I'm right about this, that it doesn't know how to work time, because time is something that is purely experiential. If you represent it, which is what the left hemisphere automatically does, it does a two-dimensional idea of time as a line. And everything goes wrong as soon as you decide that time is a line like that. It has direction, yes, but it's not a line, and it doesn't have points, and it's certainly not made up of moments. It is a continuous flow, as life is, and as everything we experience is. So, in that sense, yes, the sort of timeless, the lack of feeling for our place in time, but the lack of feeling for our place in space, in geography, the lack of feeling for a home. We are all orphans now. We have no home. We're sort of slipping around on the impermeable surface of the earth instead of having our roots deeply in it, in the way that pretty much everybody used to until we were deracinated by the Industrial Revolution. And then by colonialism and other movements that have changed the way in which we relate to place. So we haven't any place, we don't understand time. These are very left hemisphere things, because it doesn't understand context. And if you like, abstraction is a way of saying, I'm not going to be bothered about context, because nothing is actually abstract. Everything we know is at least something that we experience in our bodies, in our emotions, and we can't get beyond or behind that. And abstraction is something that the left hemisphere makes for purposes of manipulating an idea and seeing where to put it on a flowchart. So I think the abstraction is, yes, part of the left hemisphere tyranny that I see we're in now. And, there are a couple of things that on a simple level that ring bells with me here. One is that not long ago I read for Paul Kingsnorth, prior to publication, his book Against the Machine, and I think it's extraordinarily good. And I think his way of seeing it's very similar, in fact, to mine, that all the important things are relational, experiential, embodied, and that's not in any way to say that they're not spiritual, because the whole idea that the body and the spirit are somehow at war with one another, this dualistic idea is in my view, a huge mistake. And so I see part of what's wrong as the tyranny of mechanical thinking, which has been growing since the Enlightenment and has got worse since the Industrial Revolution, and recently very much worse with the rise of an engineering vision in the 20th century of what a human being was. We are just machines. And now, belatedly, long after physics, which found 100 years ago that in fact there was nothing mechanical in the universe at all, biologists went on perversely saying that although inanimate matter might not be mechanical, at least living beings were. But I mean, and privately, most of them thought this was ridiculous, but they said, I can't say anything against it or I'll lose my job. But at last, people are coming out and saying, you know, biologists are saying, of course, there is purpose, of course there are values, and organisms demonstrate this very strongly. So I think it's a very mixed picture. We're at the end of something, you know, when you say the end of the liberal order, it sounds like something very good is breaking down and something that might be worse is coming. But there's a way in which one can look at it, that something that was rotten to the core is now showing itself to be rotten. It was materialistic, it was reductionist, and people are now, young and old, are beginning to see a different perspective, which is much more like the richer, more intuitive understanding of things that the right hemisphere gives. And when I say intuitive, I just need to, because I don't know how much people can be expected to know about the hemisphere theory, but the right hemisphere is not just pretty and fey and somewhat creative. The right hemisphere is more intelligent than the left, and I mean intelligent in every sense, emotionally, socially, yes, but also cognitively. It is far more subtle, it has greater intuition, it's the only one that really understands imagination and understands what life is. So we really need to encourage the right hemisphere's view. And one way of looking at this disastrous mess that we're in is that it gives the opportunity for a shake-up big enough for us to begin to say, we've got it wrong with the way we've been looking at the world, we've got to change.
Yes, amen to that. And there is, this is actually something that came up at Breaking Convention, the psychedelic science conference I co-organized that just ended a couple of days ago. And there was a great track by my colleague, who's another director, Peter Hughes. Don't know if you know Peter's work at all, Iain. Yeah, he's a philosophy lecturer at the University of Exeter. And so there was a whole track on panpsychism and animism. You know, Peter's written a lot about Spinoza and others. And he made this point that stuck with me, where he said it was more useful to think about the question of what is consciousness, not between the sort of materialism, panpsychist, idealist divide, as whether matter is all there is or whether consciousness is all there is, but actually as an obsession with the brain, and the brain being the only place that consciousness can exist. And there's a great book as well called The Light Eaters, which came out about a year ago, which is all about plant consciousness. And it's fast. And this question comes up in that field as well. It's a journalist really investigating that field. It's absolutely fascinating how vitriolic biologists can be about even the word behavior. Plant behavior is a real trigger word for some biologists, and others are okay with it. But this is an interesting question, like how, for you, especially as someone who's researched the brain so much, but I know that maybe you don't want to be labeled a panpsychist, but I would say you're Whiteheadian perhaps, or you're influent. Maybe you define it yourself, but how do you view panpsychist? Yeah, how do you view the relationship between consciousness and the brain?
Good. Okay. Fasten your seatbelts. So I don't view the brain as certainly the emitter of consciousness. I view it not even as a transmitter of consciousness, but as the permitter of consciousness. So it is what consciousness gets funneled through into our being, and that consciousness is in the whole of us, in our whole body. And I mean, just on a neurological level, the complexity of nerves in the gut, there are more nerves in the human gut than there are in a dog's brain, and a dog is not a stupid animal. And most of these are actually giving information to the brain from the gut. Now, that is interesting in itself, isn't it? Because we've always thought that the brain controls everything. But as usual, it's a two-way system. Everything in the cosmos, not I was going to say in life, but I think further than that, everything is, there's no such thing as item A affecting item B without itself being affected. And so everything is an encounter, and those encounters take place in consciousness. Now, my view of consciousness is that it is the ultimately ontological primitive. You cannot get behind it. Nothing can have given rise to consciousness. I mean, people have been trying for 100 years to find a way in which they can get consciousness out of the brain or out of matter, and nobody has got the slightest bit near to a workable or plausible idea of how that could happen. So I'm convinced that consciousness is the primary thing. Matter we've never seen. Nobody has ever seen matter. All they've seen in their consciousness, and their consciousness is the root of everything that they know. In their consciousness, they've experienced things that have qualities they call material. And that's very important because, you see, I don't believe that consciousness and matter are wholly separate. I think they're distinguishable, obviously, but they're not wholly separate, but in a rather important way, that their relationship is as phases of the same entity. And what do I mean by phases? I mean not a temporal phase, but I mean a phase in the sense that physicists and chemists talk about phases of a substance. And the obviously important substance is water. And water has a translucent phase when it's fluid and it flows across your hand and all the rest. But it also has a phase where it's completely opaque, it's hard, it's immovable unless given a mighty push. And that is also water. And then in this room and in the rooms where you all are sitting, there are literally tons of water suspended in the air, which you can't see. Now, which of these is water? My answer to that is they're all water, they're different phases of water. So when people say, well, matter doesn't look like consciousness, I say, well, no, but ice doesn't look like the atmosphere, and it doesn't look like the stream that passes my house. So they are phenomenologically different expressions of that primal whatever it is that creates the cosmos, and I believe is conscious. And that is a view that would be shared by most of the great wisdom traditions around the world. They have pretty much all come to the conclusion that consciousness is primary. And if I may just gloss for a moment, why bother with matter? I think what matter does for consciousness is that it does two important things. One will sound like obviously good and the other not so good. But believe me, they're both very important and good. One is to provide a degree of persistence. So my thoughts, you can't see them, they disappear as soon as they're said or thought or whatever they go. But this table I'm sitting at, absent a cataclysm, will be here tomorrow morning. So that's the first thing. And the other is resistance. Now, we live in a world in which we don't understand the important point about the coincidence of opposites. We think there are things that are just good. And therefore, of course, what follows from that is just more and more of them will be better and better. We may have noticed in some cases or tried to blot out the awareness that often by having more and more of something, it gets worse. And then there's a neglected something that is its opposite, that we've demonized, that actually we need something of. And the obvious example is freedom. We all agree that freedom is something good. But actually, if you pursue more and more freedom, then you end up in a chaotic state where tyranny will become the next development, and so the very thing you feared you get in spades. So there's that, and resistance. Without resistance, no thing can be creative. Everything that is created comes out of a flow that has resistance. Without resistance, there cannot be a flow, by the way, as well. Without resistance, the river that passes my house is not a river. It has banks. The banks offer resistance. They make it the river. They don't somehow constrain the river not to be a river. In fact, by their constraints, they make it a river. And we've got a ridiculous view, a lot of us in the modern world, that anything that acts as a constraint on us must be got rid of. Anything that nature has given us, if it acts in any way to constrain us, must be got rid of. And instead, we'll create a machine that'll do everything we want. I mean, I don't know where to begin on how that's going to be bad, but you know a lot of things that I could say, and I imagine you'd agree with me.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this shows up, in people's relationship to nature, where there's a kind of fantasy of, indigenous people lived in this beautiful kind of Rousseauian paradise of balance with nature, and actually a real relationship with nature is complex, like a relationship with anyone. Sometimes it's trying to kill you, and sometimes, I think I've said this story before.
Exactly.
In one of these. There's some crows who when I walk my dog, there's two crows in particular who I believe are a couple who have turf. All the crows have turf in this forest, and I've started feeding them dog treats over about a year. And now when they see me, they're very, very. They follow me basically through their turf. And I had this thought the other day that I really must develop a new relationship with these crows, because I'm being a bit of a people pleaser with the crows, and I'm going to have to put some boundaries in place. And then that got me into a whole train of thought where I thought, well, this is animism. This is it. This is nature. We put walls up to nature because sometimes we need to, and because we have to be in this. And that's what I think many animistic cultures really talk about this and understand this. It's a relationship, not you get what you want out of it. And if you don't get what you want, you go and find something else. So there's an implication. I also have a panpsychist view and probably animistic view, and the distinction between those is quite fine depending who you ask. But I'm also working on a book proposal about how AI is changing religion. So I've been really diving into this question of, can AI become conscious in the way that we would understand consciousness? Now, if the brain is a permitter of consciousness, and it's a sufficiently complex system, what's your position on whether artificial intelligence could become sentient, conscious in the way that we might understand each other to be?
Well, I may have a slightly disappointing answer to this, which is that I can't rule out that this could be possible because I don't know enough. None of us does. If there are, and it's an idea with which I have an uneasy relationship, that there are untethered spirits, some of them with good intentions, angels, and others that with less benign intentions, demons and so on. If they can enter into people and places, as some people certainly believe, then why could they not enter into a system that gave them free rein? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know where I stand on any part of what I've just said. I have no experience myself of spirits of any kind. I'm an incredibly prosaic person. I've never had any interesting experiences on drugs. I mean, I'm not particularly interested in having them, I suppose. And as a young man, I never much dabbled in them. But since I've become better known and so on, a lot of people have said, "Oh, you must try," And to cut a long story short, I've tried marijuana. I've inhaled it properly. I've eaten the cakes dripping with syrup. I've, pretty much inhaled the cake, and it doesn't do anything for me. I'm with people and I'm going, look, it's 3/4 of an hour since I had this. Is it supposed to be doing anything? I've had the same experience with mushrooms, which was one of the ones I really put my money on. and even intravenous ketamine given to me by a fellow doctor who was prepared to do this and sit with me. Basically, no angels, no interesting experiences, nothing. So I'm the most boring protector. I've never had any kind of out of this world experience, except that all I'd say is that my view of this world is that it is out of this world. You know, there is nothing normal about this world. It is the most extraordinary miracle, and one should never lose sight of that. And so perhaps that's my compensation. So I don't know about whether AI could. I suspect not, because because what we mean by the sort of consciousness we have, it's the only consciousness we can know, and therefore it's the only thing to which we can apply the word consciousness, is that it is embodied. I am a conscious being, and as a result, I have a body, I have feelings, I know that I can suffer, I know that I will die, I can love, I can regret things in the past, I can look forward to a delighted future, I can be creative, I can love a piece of music, I can love a piece of architecture, I can certainly love poems, but I don't think an AI can do this because it's all related to having a body. Music is a very, very physical phenomenon. It's not just patterns in the sky. Poems mean nothing if they don't refer to experiences that only humans can have. Information about those experiences can be fed into as much as you like into AI, but it's not the same as having the experiences. So I would be extremely skeptical. You know, I'm very, very skeptical, but because I'm a cautious guy, I would never say it could never be. I don't know. So that's it. But the nature thing is, can we go back to that a bit? Because I believe there is at the moment an attack on nature, and AI may be part of a way of preferring things we have made to nature. Now, nature by its name means something that is always being born or about to be born. And so it's something that comes into being that is always fresh, always creative. And this seems to me like the nature of the cosmos that I recognize and the nature of the divinity that I recognize. So it is always bringing something into being which we don't understand the beginning of. A single cell is doing so many million things every second that nobody alive has the slightest idea how this happens. I mean, we can talk about mechanisms, we can know a lot about cytology, cell biology, and so on, and believe me, I've immersed myself in a lot of it. But nobody, if asked, how does a cell know what it knows? Never mind a plant know what it knows, and plants do, I'm absolutely with you there. I mean, that would be a whole topic, but I wrote about it in The Matter with Things. But how they know these things, what they know, what they understand, and so on, is something else. How they behave is something we don't understand. And the left hemisphere doesn't like something it hasn't given to itself. So if it is something comes to it as a gift from God, it is immediately resentful. It doesn't like that. Who is this person who thinks he can give me a gift? All the things that matter are things that I made, and I understand them because I made them. And I don't care about all that other stuff. It's out of my ken and out of my control. It's all part of wanting to control everything. And I just feel that at the moment there is a catastrophic revolt against nature, and there is nothing more fundamental. Nature is that out of which we come and to which we return. Nature is our mother, and to attack nature in the way it is attacked now is a heinous crime.
Absolutely, and I do think there's a link with certainly AI, but more broadly social technologies as well. But I mean, just in terms of AI is an oracle that can only look into the past because it's fed on data from the past, and so all of its novelty isn't true novelty. Its novelty is combinations of previous things, so it doesn't have that real emergent newness. But the more time that we spend using AI tools, which I do use myself for some tasks, you know, there's a hidden danger in it. In that, and there's a book by Shannon Valor called the AI Mirror, and she makes this point: we stop asking our own questions, we stop being in the uncertainty of the
Yes.
human condition, and it starts to answer. And I'm seeing this rise a lot at the moment, where it's just this. So it's so easy to just, well, I'll just ask the AI. I won't do it. You know,
Yeah, oh God, yes, yes.
can't do it.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, go on.
Go on. No, no,
Sorry.
no, no. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, and then I'll keep.
Well, I mean, not only at this very simplest level is it a bad idea to outsource our thinking, our imagination, and so on to a machine, because if you don't use it and exercise it regularly, you lose it. And this seems to be behind what I mentioned earlier, the reports from the coalface of teachers in schools and universities about the way things are going in those environments. But what I also feel about AI is exactly this, that it can't create, it can only simulate creation. And a very important point you touched on is it doesn't seem to recognize uncertainty. Now, one of the things that happens to you as you grow older, if you've lived a good life and you've thought at all, is that you become progressively less certain. Such figures as Montaigne, St. Paul, the Buddha, all show us this, that wisdom is that you know less, and it doesn't mean you become more ignorant. Ignorance is what you have before you know. Unknowing is what you have after you finish with knowledge. And that is something that cannot happen with AI. And I know a number of cases where the AI is definitely wrong, and it is absolutely adamant that it is right. It doesn't have, I may have got this wrong. So, and that seems to me fascinating, because, you know, if you ask most people, what is one of the characteristics of a human being and makes us so importantly great? They wouldn't say that we're uncertain, but I believe it is a very important human characteristic. And a world-famous pianist wrote to me and said that he had given a copy of a page from, I think I'm right in saying that it was Chopin. It was from one of the Chopin nocturnes, and he had given it to the AI and said, "Where does this come from?" And it said, it's from a ballad by Liszt. And he said, no, it isn't. It's from this volume, which is Chopin's Preludes, you know, and it's been so known for ever since Chopin died. And it said, no, you're wrong. It is by Liszt. And eventually he said, no, for this reason, and this reason, I'm going to insist that it's wrong. And then it did something very interesting. It said something that sounded like a pat phrase that it had learned. It was something like, it may be that I have made a mistake or something, but it came very late in the process.
Yeah, and it's interesting, as I've learned researching this book, the AI that we are interacting with, it works interestingly. It's very mimetic in the sense that they design characters, and when you're interacting with ChatGPT, you're actually interacting with a butler character, and what it's answering is, what would this character answer in response to this question? Which is why you can then ask it to be a moody teenager or whatever it is. So you have this kind of absurd kind of swirl of disconnected semi-archetypal kind of responses. Now, yeah, it's also interesting actually on that point. It doesn't do negative prompting very well. It can't do negative. So if you say, you've just made an image, that person has 3 arms, get rid of one of the arms. It shouldn't have 3 arms. It'll do 3 arms again, or it'll do another arm. And I asked it, why is this? And it said, well, it doesn't do negative prompting well. And my friend Matthew Siegel, who was at Breaking Convention, who's a Whiteheadian scholar and, you know, philosopher.
I know Matt very well.
Matthew,
Yes,
yeah.
we're Whiteheadians together. Yeah.
Yeah, and he said, it was over dinner, and he said, we're okay then. I said, well, why do you say that? And I think it might have been Whitehead or someone else. You're saying, well, like that the negation is something core to human consciousness, and if it can't do that, then it's this kind of sign of actually what it truly is. This kind of
it's fascinating, because that connects with the uncertainty point. That, you know, again, it's very much a mistake to imagine that negation is something that's, well, negative. Even the word negative has a bad kind of overtone, but all it means is denying that something is the case. Negare in Latin is to deny. And so that mode is extraordinarily important and is actually the only way in which you can approach the divine, I believe. In other words, the so-called apophatic path, in which you can get rid of what is false, but you can't state what is true. I'd have to finesse that, but we haven't got time for that. But anyway, that's broadly my position. And so that's very good that, it can't negate. I hadn't heard that point. Thank you. That's brilliant, because it is totally essential to the way we understand and learn.
Absolutely. So last question before we're going to open up to Q&A, everyone. So have your questions ready. But a big focus of what I'm doing with Kainos and where I want us to kind of all move is finding a way, like you said, you mentioned the word hope, hope. Don't know if you've come across Byung-Chul Han's book on hope. I think you'd like it a lot, Ian. It's very good. He's a philosopher. And he kind of frames hope as something rooted in realism and despair even, and then still forward leaning, and he distinguishes it from optimism, which is kind of there's a fixed point in the future, which is it's a great
I often
point.
call myself a hopeful pessimist.
Yes, that's quite good. Yeah. So in that vein, I'm curious about I very much agree about the need to move more into the right hemisphere's view in the world and find that greater balance. Now, what are some of the ways that you think we can begin to do that collectively at the moment within the current context we're living in? What gives you hope in that regard?
Well, in a way, what gives me hope is that nobody's got a plan for it. That would worry me and think we're back in the bad old left hemisphere world. What I like is that people's response to what is wrong at the moment is negative. So at least they're calling it out. But there's been much that has been very wrong with the way things have been drifting since about the beginning of this millennium, in my view. And maybe just due to my being an old fart, but I think it's that, actually, objectively, in lots of ways, things have got quite a lot worse. And so the fact that people are spotting that, are resisting it, and yes, not certain what needs to be done, but being lured towards certain goals. You see, I think the problem lies in the fact that we think that, even if we don't actually actively think that we're machines, we think that every system works in a sort of mechanistic way, which is that A pushes B, and then B pushes C, and C pushes D, and so on. A chain reaction pushed hydraulically from behind. I don't think this is a very helpful metaphor for how almost every system I know, certainly the living systems, work. They seem to work by being drawn from in front. And I think that when you're being drawn from in front, you shouldn't have too definite an idea of what it is you're being drawn towards. You should have a definite idea of the veracity of that lure, of that pull. You should feel it. You should say, this is where we should go. But if I ask you, so where exactly are we going? If you came up with a clear picture, I think I'm not going to follow you because you've got it wrong. You misunderstand what this is. Now, biology and everything, spiritual life works like this. There is a goal, in a sense, in that it is to go in a certain direction. What exactly it is that you are achieving, you don't know while you're achieving it. And I mean, to be a biologist for a moment, I mean, the thing that really, really amazes me is that you interfere with the development of an embryo in a way that it would never naturally come across. It has no difficulty very often in going round the obstacle and then resuming the track that it should be on. Now that is extraordinary if you think about it, because it means that it's not just being pushed by directions from behind, but actually knows where it's supposed to be going. And some of these are quite dramatic. You can interfere with the development of a tadpole head, which is an extraordinary thing in itself, a four-dimensional transformation into a completely different head, the head of a frog. And if you interfere with this, in many cases, and sometimes by different mechanisms or paths in different tadpoles, it will nonetheless achieve the evolution of the head of a frog. So this is a better and importantly different way of thinking about the direction of things. And when people ask me, so what do we do? I'm a very annoying and frustrating person on this one, because I say, if I were to specify 6 things that we ought to do, everyone would go, oh good, that's all right, then we don't have to make anything different, we just do these 6 things and we carry on as before. It's like putting a sticking plaster on a cancer. But actually, unless there is a radical change of heart, a change of the whole way we see the world, nothing is important. I said this before, but a change of heart, when it's said it from a spiritual person, is a wonderful thing, but you don't really know what it means. But some of the guidance about what it might be, I have laid out, I believe, in describing what the world is like to the left hemisphere and what the world is like to the right hemisphere. And so a lot of people have said to me, after reading often just the Master and his emissary, they say that once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. You see it everywhere, and you understand its importance. And people write and say, you've changed my life. People even write and say, you've saved my life, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing, very humbling to hear. But I didn't intend that could happen. But for people, it shows them something. And so I think the ideas need to be promulgated, and even if only 3% of people begin radically to change the way we look at the world, we can hope that it will catch fire. As Margaret Mead said, all movements in the history of mankind started off as the thoughts of a small group. There is no other way that they can start. So,
yeah, beautiful. And I've certainly your work has provided an incredibly useful frame for me in that regard. And if I tune into it links to something you said, in the sense that if we're orienting to an attractor in the future, and we kind of that we're moving towards sort of in good faith, so to speak. There's a certain level of embracing complexity and uncertainty that comes with that, and those are
absolutely.
And with that, like in a mystical experience, or an encounter with the sacred, your view after an encounter like that, or an experience of awe in general, is there's a clarity of a widened frame that you never could have experienced from the previous mode of thinking. And so there is this kind of that seems to be the way that certainly maybe human experience evolves and changes. And so, yeah, I think they all sort of thread together. So that feels like a very nice place to open up for some questions and thoughts. And who would, Tom, perfect person to start. Go ahead, man.
Dr. McGilchrist, hello. I will never tire of telling you that I am one of those people whose life you changed and whose life you saved. So it is completely true of me.
Wow.
And it has been the most transformational model of the world that I've ever encountered. So first off, thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
I will never repay it. Second, feel free not to answer this because it's wildly skeptical, but I've wanted to ask you this for ages. You may not even be familiar, but there has been this phenomenon across the US right now called the Telepathy Tapes, which surrounds a group of non-speaking autistic children with very low executive function and low verbal communication. And the moment I saw that, I thought to myself, blimey, that sounds like reduced left hemispheric function. But also these guys seem to have access to non-local consciousness in terms of their mystical abilities, telepathy and psi abilities. So again, like wildly speculative, but the first thing I thought of was your theory, and I don't know whether you'd encountered it or if you had any thoughts.
I have heard it, yes, and I think it's very interesting. I haven't seen I think there is a film or series of films or something, but so I wouldn't say I've seen, as it were, the evidence of this, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, autism is a very interesting and complicated thing. In many ways, a lot of people with autism are somewhere down what psychiatrists refer to as the schizo-autistic spectrum. So they're somewhat like people with schizophrenia. And as you probably know, I argue that people with schizophrenia seem to be very clearly overusing their left hemisphere in compensation for a non-functioning or hypo-functioning right hemisphere. And some people with autism are indeed very like that. They have very poor capacity to understand what other people mean, to get inside that other person, to see what it is they're thinking and experiencing. But it's also true that some seem to have an almost opposite condition, if you like to put it that way, in which, for example, Temple Grandin, who's probably the world's most famous advocate for people with autism, she says, and I thought it was very striking, that she was amazed when she learned that other people often thought in words. She said, I mean, she was just genuinely perplexed. How could you think in words? She always thinks in pictures. Now, that thinking in pictures is much more, if you like to put it that way, is much more, likely to be right hemisphere mediated. And I think that one of the mysteries about autism is that it's not just that, as it were, the left or right hemisphere is not functioning, but something about the communication between them is non-standard. And so it leads to perhaps some rather unusual situations which have their drawbacks, but also some which may have unusual talents. And this is often the case in neurology and psychiatry, that hidden in a deficit is something that gives you an extra skill.
Brilliant, thank you. Simon, you'll be up next. Just something that popped into my head, Ian. This is the problem of being a doctor, isn't it? People are always like, could you look at this mole? Or now my wife's a psychologist. Could you help me with my child? But I've often wondered about this because I think, I've had this conversation with a few people. Like, I do think in words, okay, like somewhat, but I don't really think in images. I think in kind of ideas have a kind of imprint to them, like a kind of emotional imprint and a kind of flow. I'm not exactly sure what, and I know other people kind of have experienced that. What is that?
I think it's the most important part of thinking. Sure. So I think that a certain amount of linear construction of propositions that seem logical can be done at a phase in trying to get towards an insight into what one believes about various things. But that may be dispensable, but what is utterly indispensable is an unconscious process in which one's thinking goes on in a way that the left hemisphere, with its idea that everything has to be explicit and verbal, wouldn't understand. So I think we all think, in fact, in forms and shapes and many other things, but we also do in our more explicit moments, especially when we're discussing an issue in, for example, a philosophy seminar or something like that. That's one of the problems with such events, is that it forces you to restrict yourself to what it is that can be put into a logical sentence. And in many ways, of course, that constraint is very valuable, but we ought never to lose sight of the fact that deep thinking often goes much further than that. And not just deep artistic thinking, but scientific thinking and mathematical thinking. In The Matter with Things, I quote many, many cases of scientists and mathematicians whose sudden insight came when they were doing something completely other, as it were, doing the ironing, but not. But so it's true that may have depended on some systematic thinking at an earlier stage. So there's always a bit of drudgery, but interestingly, Niels Bohr's notebooks contain no words at all, only pictures.
There's a great Carlo Rovelli book. I forget the title of which one it is, but he talks at length about how there's this kind of union between physicists who have these kind of almost visionary experiences where they're just like, this is how I think things work, and then they find a mathematician to pair with who will do the math bit of it, and this is quite like interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic.
I mean, I mustn't hold things up, but just as a personal aside, one of the things I didn't expect after publishing The Matter with Things, no, after The Master in His Hemisphere, which doesn't have any physics in, The Matter with Things does, was the number of physicists who wrote to me. I thought, neurologists, psychiatrists, perhaps philosophers would write and so on. But I didn't expect physicists. But several physicists wrote quite independently and said, this is absolutely fascinating for us. And so I got into conversations with them, and I dared to put some physics into The Matter with Things. I'm not a physicist. My last physics was at school, and rather boring. And I wish they'd introduced me to black holes and things like that. But anyway, I have a number of friends now, amongst internet friends, amongst physicists. And before I say anything, I run it by them and say, am I making an ass of myself by saying this? And if they say not too big a one, I go ahead with it.
Right. So who's next? Simon, go ahead.
Wow, thank you. So many ways to go and places to go. This has been beautifully expansive. I feel remarkably shifted and changed, including just that throwaway just now. If we're hiding something, what's it expanding within us? Because I'm immediately thinking if we're offshoring our consciousness if we're offshoring our decision making to AI, what's that expanding within us? Or pick a question. The question I was going to ask is, to ask you to expand on a comment place you were going earlier. It feels like something of a fulcrum, which was the Trinity is something that you're taking now to be more and more profound.
Right,
It feels connected with, the space of uncertainty and negation.
Right. Well, my first insight into the Trinity came when a very simple Franciscan friar came to my school. I was probably about 17. And he said, well, the thing is about the Trinity is one way of thinking about it is it's like a book. Is the book what was in the mind of the person who wrote the book? Or is it this copy of the book on the table that we can touch and open and read? Or is it what happens in the mind of the reader when they're reading it? And obviously in his mind, he was talking about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And whether or not one wants to constrict oneself to that in a religious sense, I think it makes a lot of sense, philosophically speaking, about the way we can view things like the relationship between consciousness and matter. And, what is a thing? Is it the product of certain processes we can specify? Is it a perception? Is it something that has effects on other people's lives? We don't know how anything ramifies between the world of the conscious and the world that we think of as not being conscious. I personally believe it is conscious, but not in some simple-minded way that I think that the chair on which I'm sitting is having thoughts about why I should get up and leave it alone. But that every kind of thing is a process, and that process takes place both in a world that we can understand as consciousness and in a world we can think of as material. And that, putting it in religious terms, I'm a panentheist. That's not a pantheist.
Iain, we can't hear you suddenly. Sorry, I think your headphones might have done that thing. Let's see. Thought it was just me for a moment, but then I saw let's see. if you go, Ian, to the bottom left where it says audio, and you click there's a little arrow, then it'll go select a microphone, select a speaker, and it might have popped into the wrong place. Oh,
But no, hang on.
yep.
No, sorry. I had it okay when I just...
Hold on, let's see. Oh, that's better.
See, machines know that I don't like them, and I have seriously, I have the Pauli effect. You know, Wolfgang Pauli, when he went into the lab, all the machines that had been working fine suddenly stopped working. And everywhere I go in the world, I go in and they say, well, it was funny, it was working this morning, and so on. I mean, I don't get me involved with any piece of machinery. Anyway, I think what I was really saying is that a panentheist is somebody who believes that God is in everything and everything is in God, not that God is just the sum total of all that is.
Yeah, it's an important distinction, isn't it? I mean, I think I probably, lean more that way than panpsychist even. It's funny, the distinctions get very... Yeah,
I know.
They're very difficult to sort of unpick. And in fact, when Bernardo Kastrup, who you know Bernardo's work, have you come across?
Oh, of course,
yeah.
I've had conversations with him that are on the internet. Yeah.
Because he's in my book, The Bigger Picture, as are you, as is Matthew Siegel, as is Peter Sursett Hughes, and I was like, oh, you're all in the same chapter together, Bernardo, and he was like, but they're panpsychists, and I'm an idealist. I was like, yes, but it's kind of you're all in the same ballpark, which he was not happy with. He's like, no, we're different. But I think
it's funny because when the two of us talked, I mean, anybody who's interested, you can Google Iain McGilchrist, Bernardo Kastrup, because we had a very good talk. It's very unusual to have such a very fruitful talk between people who don't altogether just agree, but largely agree. And so I didn't feel that at all. Neither, I don't think he did either.
I think he was ribbing me, to be honest.
Yes, he is, maybe so.
Because he's quite open-minded and he's quite up for pretty much any conversation. But let's move. We've got about 15 minutes left. So Terry, go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Hello,
so
Terry.
Deeply inspiring.
Oh, thank you.
I'll ask this question in the negative. I'm deeply drawn, and sure you're correct about our need to rely more on the right hemisphere and intuition. But how do we do that without falling into the traps prior to the Enlightenment, when we did live that way and made so many bad decisions doing it? So how do we not do that?
Yes. Well, the first thing to say is that we didn't live in the right hemisphere in the period that you're talking. I mean, the Reformation was the first great leap forward of the left hemisphere. And although it can be justified in the sense that it got rid of things that were either abuses or superstitious, then that, of course, is its main justification. But it also completely disenchanted the world. It became very materialistic and literalistic about the way in which it understood things. So this whole business of going around decapitating statues shows that they don't understand that a symbol is not considered to be the saint or to be God. It's to symbolize it, and that you don't have to decapitate it. So they were terribly, terribly literal-minded people. So all was not well prior to the Enlightenment, and all has not been well since the Enlightenment. But I think that intuition, I have 3 chapters on intuition in the Matter of Things, its proper uses, its limitations, and how we can be attentive to it. And I think the answer is that when I talk about intuition, I'm not saying 2 things. First of all, I'm not saying that if you follow your intuitions, you will always be right. And the second thing I'm saying is that not everything you think might be an intuition is. I'm talking about something that feels much deeper than, say, a way you've just always thought about something because that's your habit. That's not what I mean. And when I say that by following your intuitions you won't always be right, of course I am correct in that. But you will not always reach the truth by following reason. One of the interesting things is that people with schizophrenia often believe the most improbable things, and we don't think of them as having accessed some kind of wisdom. But as G.K. Chesterton said, they have not lost their reason. They have lost everything but their reason. And so in many ways, their thoughts are totally rational, but devoid of any understanding of earthly context. So, for example, they're sitting there, and for reasons that will be to do with the way their brain is working, they're hearing hallucinations. And they look around the room and there's no one there. So they're entirely rational. They think, well, somebody must be speaking, but they're not in this room, so it must be the neighbors. Now, how are the neighbors getting their voice into my room? There's a plug socket down there. That's the place in which the sound must be coming. So they think all kinds of bizarre things and jump to incredible conclusions, because the left hemisphere does jump to conclusions and is largely deluded. But they're not irrational. And just being rational can be at times a very unreasonable thing to do. I mean, if you are somebody who tries to deal with your relationships in the same way you would deal with a legal case as an attorney or a barrister in court, you'll soon discover that you don't have many friends and that you don't have a very satisfying life. So there's an awful lot more to us than just being rational, and that can be summed up as the imaginative and the intuitive, which are not the same things, but they work together, I believe. And that's a thing, as I say, I've unfolded in a few chapters in The Matter with Things. Sorry not to be able to answer at greater length, but that's always the case, you know.
That's fascinating, though. Yeah, it's really fascinating. So let's go Drew, and then Tom will finish with you in a nice circularity.
Hi, Ian. Thank you very much for the call here today. This is fantastic. Such a pleasure to be here. Just had a question, or maybe your thoughts around collaboration versus competition. Just from the framing of our economic system, I tend to dwell there fairly often. And I think I heard a quote, probably Daniel Schmachtenberger, saying something along the lines of maybe like, as a species, we are far more collaborative than we are competitive, but it seems nowadays we're far more competitive than we are collaborative, especially, let's say, in light of all this tariff stuff that's going on lately. So my thoughts are that I sort of think that collaboration is maybe more right hemisphere based because it's less certain and it's out of our control, whereas competition is we're reaching for certainty. Competition is sort of like more an adolescent approach, and collaboration requires more maturity. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts around these kind of concepts, or maybe I'm way off the path here. I don't even know.
No, you're not at all. Not at all. I mean, let's say, first of all, I think we need both competition and collaboration. But as we need the left and right hemispheres, it is still true that the right hemisphere is more important. It knows more, it sees more, it is the one that helps us understand. The left hemisphere has a very important role, but it's limited to grabbing and getting. It's not very bright. It doesn't really understand the picture, whereas the right hemisphere does. Now, competition is a healthful thing if it is, first of all, to some degree, not excessive, and balanced also with collaboration. On the hemisphere, the hemisphere correlates, you're absolutely right. And I'd just like to underline that the reason that you are so right is that the left hemisphere, its whole value is power and comfort. It's getting things for itself, for pleasure and having control. And so competition obviously means that you go all out for that. But the right hemisphere is the seat of empathy. And there is, to make it complicated, there is something called cognitive empathy that the left hemisphere has, but it's not the same as emotional empathy. And really what we need is a combination of both, of cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. And in doing that, we see that this other actually has interests of their own that are not so far from our own, and that we might build a bridge. And this might actually prove rather fruitful for everybody. So it's creative, and it is right hemisphere derived, and it is a complete lie that the history of evolution is pure competition. Competition is a very significant part of it. But here's the kicker. The species that have thrived best have been those that learnt how to collaborate. And so, to come to your social point, what we need to do is not get rid of competition altogether. Without competition, things wouldn't be so good, actually. We need a degree, it's healthful. And in school, I think it's wrong to suppose that in our sort of touchy-feely new schools there won't be competition. No, there must be competition. It's actually how people get inspired to do things, and I'm going to do more. And it's good at that stage and in that sense. But collaboration is the greater thing, and we need to learn how to do that. And if in school we don't learn how to collaborate, then that's not being good schooling.
Brilliant. So, final question from Tom.
Thank you for letting me ask 2 questions. So I was blown away by your recent conversation with Michael Levin, where he talked about how cancer cells grow because they are dissociated from the electromagnetic field of the body. And when they are returned to the electromagnetic field of the body, they stop being cancerous, which for me struck me as this fundamentally kind of left hemispheric notion of when you are dissociated, you can't feel the whole and you grow at its expense, which is like us. But the returning to the field, and this is again speculative, but it made me think of love, that essentially the electromagnetic field of the body that we return to is love and feels like love. And maybe that's just too romantic a notion, but I was wondering if you had a similar thought.
Well, I do. There's so much there, but I'll try and limit what I have to say. But yes, we know that varying the electromagnetic field around a cancer can turn it away from being a cancer and into a constructive part of the body again. So that is really extraordinary. It shows how important fields are, and it may be that fields are in fact what exist. My understanding of action at a distance, the idea of quantum entanglement, how can it be that this element here, this particle, and this particle that's far too far away for anything to pass between them, move at the same time, so that one of them changes its spin and the other one, not even a millionth of a second later, but at the exact same time changes? Well, the answer is because they're part of the same thing. At the moment that I become a husband, my partner becomes a wife. I mean, that's the way it works. We don't have to wait and apply again. It's just like, that's the relationship, so there we are. So what I'm really saying is that these fields, I think, are very important, and that when it comes to love, first of all, I think that love is not just, I mean, it's the most amazing thing in the universe, but it can't be limited to simply what goes on between two human beings that love one another. That is a part and a manifestation of something that is much bigger. That is my belief. And that idea of an electromagnetic field is, I think, right. There is an electromagnetic field, literally, that is measurable by a machine, that radiates around the heart. And I think the radius of the field is something like 12 feet. So it is quite different, actually, being close to somebody from talking to them when you're not close to them. And so the body is always surrounded by fields of energy. And these energies can be experienced very clearly. I mean, perhaps it's over-confessional of me, but I have experience with somebody who I very, very much love, that if you put your forehead with the other forehead at the same point, you can actually feel a force. I mean, it's a definite sensation. It's not the skin sensation. There's a kind of energy that happens from the two places coming together. Now, I know that I think I know so little, but I think I know that in an Indian yoga idea, it's quite probably explicable why that would be the case. But I'm just saying that there are energy fields that can be perceived and felt and are completely real. And I believe that probably that is how we come to be able to, or some people come to be able to see things that other people like myself cannot. There we are. Sorry.
Beautiful. Thank you, Tom, for the question as well. And
yeah, thank you very much for some lovely questions.
Yes, always the way with this wonderful group. And I have a sense that we're all about to press foreheads with our significant others after this. I know. I was thinking.
Well, it's a fascinating. It's a fascinating experience, and it infallibly seems to work, I find. So there we are.
Wonderful. Well, Iain,
I think it's where you put the bindi, isn't it? It's where the red.
Yeah, which is the third eye in
third eye,
some of those traditions, right? So
that's right. Well, there we are. It's probably the third eye as well. There we go. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I feel like I've skittered around over so many topics and not really treated anything well enough, but that's the nature of the game.
That is the nature. And certainly I think very few in this room or watching on Substack and elsewhere will have that same sensation. I think it's been quite a beautiful and rich conversation. I've certainly enjoyed it immensely. So
thank you. I've enjoyed it very much too. Thanks, you for all of you being here.
Let's do our traditional unmuting and thanking Iain and saying goodbye.
Thank you so much, Iain.
Thank you.
Thank you. Much love.
Thank you.
Thank you,
very
Ali.
much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.